joining me this morning. Hi, Denny. Hi, Avery. I hope you guys all had a wonderful spring break. I hope you all had an opportunity to get some rest, have some fun. I was in Chicago visiting my nephew. Some of you guys may remember my little redheaded nephew. I did a lesson on him in quarter 1 when we learned about genes. And so I got to spend some time with him. Hi, Kai. Hi, Carl. And I got to meet my little niece. Remember we did that lesson? It was cold at times, yes. And then remember when we did that lesson, I had you guys guess what her phenotypes were going to be. And proud to tell you that she has brown hair, not red hair. And right now she still has blue eyes. And so, most babies are born with blue eyes, and then it takes a little bit for their actual colors to come through. So we'll see in just a little bit longer. Hi, Kaya. We'll see in just a little bit longer if her eyes stay blue, if they're going to turn brown or go to hazel, and what it's going to be. But fun fact, she's got my mom's lips. And she's got, yep, just like puppies, Elias, exactly. Yeah, their eyes, when they're first born, everything's kind of blurry. And so just like puppies and kittens that they can't see the first couple days, it's very similar, right? And so it's been really fun to spend some time with them, and they're just so cute. If we have time, I can always show you videos during small group or something, because trust me, I have plenty. So I'm hoping all of you had a wonderful spring break, had time to see your family, spend some time to yourself, get outside. I heard it was really, yes, yeah, good. And then hopefully you guys had a chance to enjoy some of the nice weather. So anywho, speaking of weather and outdoors, this unit that we're going to be starting this week is all about ecology. So I thought for today's lesson, instead of focusing on one specific unit or topic, I was going to go over a broad, like kind of the basics of ecology that you're going to get into more depth and more information as you go through the lessons this week. But overall, introduce some vocabulary words, introduce a couple of concepts that you're going to be learning and reading about this week. So let's go ahead and get started. Now, I did not have a note sheet for you, but there is not a lot of writing on each one of these slides. So a lot of what your notes may look like may be writing some vocabulary words down, a couple of phrases, but it's going to be a lot more me verbally explaining. So try to make sure that you're listening and that you're not so focused on writing, because that, you're going to have an opportunity. Hi, Lily. You're going to have an opportunity to take notes during your lessons. So this time it's just a good opportunity for you guys to hear and see some really cool pictures of some awesome animals and habitats. All right. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Make sure you have a pen and paper, pencil, maybe you have 2 monitors, a split screen, whatever you need to do to feel prepared, okay? So let's go ahead and get started. So when we talk about ecology is the study of living organisms and how they interact with their environment. So it's very similar, but slightly different. We'll get into that. Don't worry, Christian. We are very similar to biology, where we know that biology is the study of life. Ecology takes it one step further, and it talks about not just life, but how it interacts with each other. So how different species are going to interact with each other and how they rely on each other, and their environment. So their environment meaning the type of soil, the nutrients, weather, climate is, the generalized area. And we'll talk about the difference between weather and climate today. And also just talking about how that all interacts with one another. And so when we talk about ecology, we really need to understand all of the different parts. And this is something that we see throughout biology in general, right? We talked about how form and function is a huge, huge theme in biology, right? But organization is that second huge theme of biology. Exactly, Christian. We're going to talk about biotic and abiotic factors. You're already getting ahead of the game. That makes me so excited to get to it. But yes, we talk about the different levels of organization, and we also mean that from ourselves. Remember, in the very, very beginning of quarter one, I talked about the organizations within our bodies and organisms and how they're set up. Whether we go with a cell, the most basic unit, a cluster of cells is a tissue. Different types of tissue make up the organs. The different types of organs make up the organ system, right? Ecology is no different. We have levels of organization. So similar to our organization of cells and how there are the actual body is created, we also take a look at the level of organizations when it comes to ecology. So our most basic unit of ecology is the individual. So we start with one individual, and then we think about it as a population. So that's multiple of the same individual, right? So we think about individual is one of the species, population is multiple of the same species. And then you have community. Community are based on the living organisms and how they interact. So in this image, what you're going to see is you're going to see that there are several different types of animals or organisms that are working together. We've got an owl, we've got the moose, it looks like we have a cougar. Those are all going to interact. There's going to be energy, and we're going to get to energy later on today too. And they've got it. Okay, maybe we've got the bald eagle. Exactly. So the community really, really focuses on the living organisms and how they interact and how they depend on one another. Then we have the ecosystem. The ecosystem now not only brings in the living organisms, but that's when we really start to talk about those abiotic factors, those non-living factors, and how the soil and how the nutrients and how the pH or the acidity levels and how the weather, all of those abiotic factors, and how an abiotic factors means non-living, and how they interact with the biotic factors, the living factors. And that's really how we come up with this ecosystem. We take it one step farther, and now we're looking at the biomes, right? Biomes are based on the areas, and we use the biome as a very basic overall view of how that temperature and the weather acts throughout the entire area. And so we consider those as climate. So that's a big difference between, and the landscapes, exactly. So when we talk about climate, weather is from day to day. The weather today in Chicago is, it's a little sunny but cold, but the climate in Chicago tends to be dry. The climate in Chicago is actually very extreme. We have extreme cold, we have extreme heat in the summers. And in Oregon, we know that the Oregon climate is more temperate. Now we see that there's a little bit of change happening over the years, but the Oregon climate in general, we don't get too hot of summers and we don't get too cold of winters. So we're actually considered a temperate zone. But we'll get to climates in a minute. And then in biosphere, the biosphere is the entire Earth. It's the level, it's within the level of the ground up until that layer of the atmosphere where all living things are. Okay, so then we've got this level of biosphere. So really, when we're talking about levels of organization, it's important because those levels are going to determine all of the different ways that we interact and what we consider. So let's talk about some vocabulary words. So we started talking about the individual, right? So we know that we've got an individual, and that is one specific species, one animal of that group is the individual. But then we have the population. So we have a group of organisms of the same species that live in the same area. Now that's really important. It has to be regional, okay? So we know that there are several different types of birds, right? And so in Oregon, we have house finches, and these house finches are incredibly common throughout all of North America. But I wouldn't consider the population in Oregon to be the same as the population here in the Midwest. So really, we want to think of a population as not just the same species, but also that they are regional, that they're from the same area. Okay. Make sure that you have had a chance to write this down. I'm going to go, hi, Cole. Hi, Emmett. I see that you guys joined us. I'm going to go ahead and move into the next slide. Then we have the community. So now we're talking about all of the populations in a geographic area. So kind of just reiterating what I was talking about in that slide. So we talked about population is more than one individual, and now we're talking about community, which are all the populations in that geographic region. Okay, so that's what we have for community. If I go on and you need me to go back, please just let me know. I'm happy to go back. Ecosystems, like I said, ecosystems are all the organisms that live in a place together with their physical environment. So we have abiotic, which are non-living, and biotic factors, which are living. And biotic factors are also anything that has ever lived. So even if you see, like if you're in a forested area and you see leaves on the ground that are starting to decompose, those are still considered biotic factors. Exactly, Christian, just like grass, right? Those are still considered biotic because they were once living. Minerals, rocks, weather, pH, those are abiotic factors. And when I say pH, I'm specifically talking about the acidity, right? We talk about the acidity in soil, we talk about the acidity in oceans, and we're going to actually have a little bit of, hi Ella, we're going to have a lab coming up that's going to talk about the acidity of environment and determine how it affects the growth. So acidity is a big thing that's considered an abiotic factor. Right. And okay, so then we have a group of ecosystems that share similar similar climates and organisms, right? And that's what we were talking about, the biomes. And so, and we are talking about climate. We think of climate as this area that has a generalized weather pattern, like desert, the taiga, tundra. These are all words that you may have heard before. These are all examples of different climates, okay? So we really think about that as temperate rainforests, tropical rainforests, these generalized weather patterns that we see in specific areas. Great. Oops, backwards. Biosphere is the part of the planet that can support life. So kind of like what I was saying, it's everything around the world that where life can live. There is a part that once you start to go up into the atmosphere, there's less and less oxygen available. And so with less oxygen, we know that oxygen is essential for what? What is it oxygen primarily for? What do we need oxygen? Why do we breathe? What's the whole purpose that we breathe? You guys remember? Like one specific reason. Okay, so the opposite, Christian. Remember that when we actually take out, right? We breathe out carbon dioxide. Good. Yeah, we export cellular respiration. You got it. And then, yep, the whole reason that we need oxygen is specifically for our bodies to go through, our cells to go through cellular respiration. And if we start to go out of the atmosphere where we have less and less oxygen, our cells can't work. It doesn't have the necessary equipment it needs to break that glucose down into ATP. Exactly, Logan. Love it. Oh my gosh. You guys make me so happy. It's a great way to start my Tuesday. So exactly. So that's why there is only a specific area up to a certain point in our atmosphere that life can be supported. Good. And that's what we call the biosphere. So the study of ecology, right? So we are really focusing on this idea, right? I told you guys that the study of ecology is really the study of interactions among organisms and between organisms and their environment. So exactly, really making sure that we're understanding it doesn't just stop at what's alive, but it's also talking about how they interact with their environment. Hi, Nick, thanks for joining us. So making sure that you understand that everything is related and everything influences each other. We cannot exist alone. And living things depend on non-living things. Okay. So now, here's a couple of notes. All organisms must interact with the living and non-living factors in their environment. So if we take a look at our infograph here, we've got this biotic factor. So we have this picture of all these living organisms, and this is supposed to model an area if we were to think of one or the other. So we've got a lot of life over on this side, but then over here, we've got a lot of abiotic factors. And so we think of this, if we remove all of the living factors, we are left with the abiotic factors. So water, dirt, soil, rocks. Look over here, we've got some weather. We've got clouds, and it looks like there's some rain, right? And so we think of this as the abiotic factors. And then when we combine them, what we end up seeing is we see a whole picture of what life and non-living factors can produce, which is a healthy ecosystem. Over here, if we don't have any rain, if we don't have any water, and the biotic factor side of things, we don't have water for these organisms to survive. So we need to have a good balance of living and non-living thing to have a thriving ecosystem. So we have different parts of the ecosystem. We already talked about abiotic components or factors, which are non-living. So these are the examples of air, water, nutrients, solar energy, right? The very first test we took in Q1 was talking about the relationship that sun has on our everyday life. And we know that the sun is the sole provider of energy. If we don't have the sun, we lose that ability to grow and create food to sustain our food webs, right? So sun is a huge part of it. And then how much sun we get in different areas are going to affect the amount of life that can grow there. So really thinking about that as well. Then we've got biotic or living components. So this is plants, animals, microorganisms, right? Anything that takes in energy, that is considered living. So even from the smallest single-celled algae, bacteria, protists, all the way to some of our largest animals like elephants, and everything in between is all considered living, especially plant life and everything. So we've got our different parts of the ecosystem. Does anyone need more time on this slide to write some stuff down? Or are we ready to move on? Okay, great. All right, so let's talk about something called the food chain. Now, one thing that I mentioned in the previous slide was something about energy, right? Energy needs to be flowing in order for life to be sustained. In order for everything to, remember, everything depends on each other. So when we think about the food chain and a food web, they're similar but different, right? So a food chain is telling us that all organisms need energy in order to survive, right? And we talked about how the sun and the autotrophs, right? Autotrophs are those living organisms that can take solar energy and create their own food. We think of this very much of plants. We think of this as anything that is just can make their own glucose and then go through cellular respiration and break it down. And then we also consider that the energy passes from one organism to another in that food chain. So if we think about food chain, you may have done this before when you were in your younger grades. I believe I taught this in 6th grade. So for some of you who had me as their 6th grade teacher, we talked about this. But the way that we get energy is by consumption. If we can't make our own foods using sun, we need to rely on other living organisms that create their own energy and their own food. So that's why there's a food chain. We need to eat in order to get that energy. So each organism in a food chain represents a feeding step or something that we called a trophic level. So there's a couple of new vocabulary words on this slide, things like food chain, and then trophic level. And so when we talk about trophic levels, this really just means the level in which you are getting your energy. So we're going to learn some more words here in just a minute. But just remember that when we're talking about the food chain, it really means one line of how it's eaten. So for example, this morning, let's think. I want you guys to be thinking of this too. What is your food chain so far? If you have had breakfast this morning, what's the food chain of the food that you ate? And if you haven't had breakfast this morning, then what about dinner the night before? What are some of the food chains that were involved? So for example, for breakfast this morning, I had an egg in it, right? Eggs and tea, exactly, Logan. Plants and then you, but you could even take it a step farther. What's the plate, right? So for me, I had an egg this morning. So my food chain is that I ate an egg, which came from a chicken. That chicken could have been given fish meal. That fish meal, which includes fish, right? So then that fish could have been eating algae in the water. And then that algae in the water was taking in the sun or energy in from the sun. So for me, that was my food chain. So Logan, it says wheat machine that transformed it, and then you. Good. So your wheat was taking in the sun, which allowed that plant to grow, and then there was some sort of processing involved. Good. What are some other food chains for you guys? Go ahead and put it in the chat. Take yourself off mute. Go ahead and share. Go ahead and let's go ahead and everybody just go ahead and put in a food chain that you guys went through in the last 24 hours. Choose one meal, one food, whatever it is. Go ahead and try it. What is the food chain? Okay, cereal, Christian. So tell me about what that cereal is stemming from. I know. It's the first Tuesday back from spring break and I'm already making you think and do work. I know. But come on, guys. We got this. There are 22 of you. I know you guys are thinking, good, pasta from grains. You had water cold, chicken nuggets. All right, Aiden, tell me a little bit about those chicken nuggets. What's the food chain for that, right? I also had ham. So I had ham this morning, which came from a pig. What's that pig gonna have eaten then? What do they feed pigs? Actually, I don't really know what they feed pigs. I just know that it's really tasty. Does anyone have pigs at their anything? Aren't they often fed like it's a pig? There's some things that pigs won't eat, I'm sure of it. I don't know what you feed pigs. Anything they will eat human. Oh, I don't believe that. I guess if they don't know though. It's a very morbid thought, and I'm going to go down other pigs. You guys, pigs are amazing animals too. They're actually very smart. So I don't want to talk about it much though, because now it's just going to make me sad. So anywho, all right. So while you guys are thinking of food chains, I knew I was going down a vortex with this. Oh, Logan. So many comments, so many thoughts. All right, so we can start thinking about these food chains, right? We can start thinking about how food chains are very, very linear and how we get that energy, right? So we have an example here. So like I said, we've got, we're gonna go in the way of the way that the energy travels. So really want to reiterate that when we're talking about food chains and when we're talking about trophic levels, the arrows go in the direction of energy. So while we look at this picture, so while they took look at this picture, it may be a little counterintuitive. Like, well, actually, the eagle is or the hawk is eating the snake, and the snake is eating the mouse, and the mouse is eating the grasshopper, and the grasshopper eats the plant. So we may be thinking, well, shouldn't the arrows be pointing in the way that they eat? But whenever we're making a model, we always want to show the direction of energy flow. So thinking about it this way, the hawk gets its energy by eating the snake. The snake gets its energy by eating the mouse. The mouse gets its energy by eating the grasshopper. These are all different ways that the energy is traveling up the food chain, right? Remember ecosystems, we need energy to be flowing in order for an ecosystem to be working. So then what I want you to pay attention to in this image is now we also have the different levels of trophic levels, right? So this is what we were talking about, those different levels of energy. So we first have the primary producers. Now, why do we think we call it a primary producer and not a primary consumer? Why do we start with the primary producers? What do you think? What do you think that means, the word producers versus consumers? Hmm. Because they produce protein. Close, Christian. You are so, so close. It's not that they produce protein, they produce ATP. Yes, that's exactly what I want to hear. So they produce ATP, right? They produce not even ATP, but they produce what's that thing that they call before it gets to ATP? They do produce ATP, glucose. You got it, my friend. Exactly. So primary producers produce glucose, right? And so they produce glucose, which we know is what we need to consume in order for our bodies to then break it down to ATP, going through that cellular respiration and give ourselves the energy. So when we say that we need to eat in order to get energy, this is what they mean. Have you ever gone so long without eating food that you start to feel weak and you start to feel faint and you like just feel drained and tired? That's because you don't have energy, that you are to kind of get you that you don't have energy. You don't have the glucose that your cells need to change it into ATP to give energies to our cells. So that's why we call them primary producers at the very beginning. They are producing the glucose. Now we talk about primary consumers. Now, why are these grasshoppers considered primary consumers? Hmm. Hmm. Because they consume the ATP. That's great. Exactly. Well, the glucose. Yes, I was just going to say, careful. They consume the glucose that then gets turned into ATP. Yes, good catch there. So it's the primary consumers. They're the first ones, right? They're the first ones in the level to eat the glucose. Then we have secondary consumers. Why is it called secondary consumers then? Why are they called secondary consumers and not tertiary consumers? They're the third one up in the food chain, right? Shouldn't that be the third one? Tertiary means third, just in case we were just to clarify. Okay. So it's not so much that that's what's left over, but more so good. I mean, these are all really good tries, Christian. You're doing great. Does someone have an idea of why they're called secondary consumers and not tertiary, even though they're in the third level up? Hmm. Okay. Good guesses. Good guesses. Because they are the second ones to consume the glucose. Exactly, Lily. I couldn't have said it better myself. That is exactly right. And then as we go up the food chain, we start to see exactly, Emmett, I'm loving it. So then as we go up the food chain, we start to see tertiary consumers and quaternary consumers. So remember, there are different, these are all called trophic levels. Trophic levels is how much energy you're getting and how far removed you are from the primary producer, from that original source of energy, right? Great. Good. Exactly like I was saying, trophic levels. So, trophic levels, excuse me. So then we were talking about producers, right? So continuing on with some of these vocabulary words. So producers are also considered autotrophs, right? Autotrophs, meaning that they make their own foods, their self-nourishment. So really focusing on the fact that they can go through photosynthesis, they can capture energy from sunlight in order to make their nutrients, specifically glucose, right? We know that at the end of photosynthesis, we take in, what do we take in? What do plants take in for photosynthesis? Or autotrophs or producers take in for photosynthesis? Well, Christian, remember, ATP is at the end of cellular respiration and they do create energy. But what are the three main things that plants need in order to grow? AKA, what are the three main things we need for photosynthesis? What's the thing that we don't get in Oregon in the wintertime, but we all crave? Light, exactly, sunlight, right? So they need sunlight. What else do we need to give plants to do photosynthesis? Light. What's the second? Water. Good. And what's the third? Close, Christian, not just any wind. Specifically, what do they need? What do we breathe out? Carbon dioxide, exactly. Which carbon dioxide is part of the air, right? Good, exactly. So photosynthesis captures energy from the sun to make nutrients. Now, we don't always, this is actually relatively new. We only found out about something called chemosynthesis over the last 40 years. This is something that is very new that scientists are still trying to learn a lot about. And that is in the deep trenches of the ocean. I'm talking about where the sun does not reach the bottom of the ocean. It used to think that everything needed sunlight in order to live, that there was no life on the bottom of the ocean floor. But we know that that's not true. In fact, we found out, thanks to the development of technology and scuba diving and equipment that allows there to be down to the bottom of the ocean where the light doesn't reach, there are actual cracks in the earth where there are chemicals being released. So things like sulfur, really hot things that live there. And that is something called chemosynthesis, where organisms can actually use the Earth's chemical or like Earth's elements that are being released into that area, and they utilize that energy and they change that, they do a chemical reaction that gives them energy and food similar to glucose, but not glucose, and allows life to exist down there. If you've ever seen Finding Nemo, there's that one scene of when they fall down the trench and then they come across that one fish where there's that glow and they're all feeling like super happy and they're getting really into it, and then they get to the thing and it's actually this really big scary fish. That's real. Exactly. That's a real thing, and those are fish that evolved by living on the ocean floor. You don't need eyes to live on the ocean floor because there's no sun to see. So you're really using other senses. subwoofers on the ocean floors, maybe. You never know. It's so close with all the vibrations, right? So great. So we have this other thing called chemosynthesis. We didn't learn too much about it, but super, super. It's just as important for the food chain as producers on Earth are up in the sunlight. So the energy-rich compounds that are produced are later used by other organisms, right? So we know that this is all related. Okay, next one. From the base of the food chain. So the producers are always going to be that first trophic level. Then we have consumers, right? And this is what we were talking about when we talked about consumers, secondary or for primary consumers, secondary consumers. And you all notice that the word consumer means to take, right? If you think about, they use the term consumer when we talk about business. And we are the consumers, people who buy the products and people who take the things. And that's exactly what consumers mean in the food chain. When we talk about consumers, we're talking about people who are eating those, eating the energy and get energy from other living things. And that's what we call heterotrophs. So, oh yeah, of course. Let me go back for just a second. And so let me go ahead and talk about heterotrophs. So heterotrophs, like different from autotrophs. So if you think of auto, right, self, right, heterotrophs are based on other, no problem, Lily, are based on having to eat other organisms to get their energy, right? So they need to eat in order to get that glucose that our body uses for cellular respiration that breaks down into ATP for our cells, right? So really important, they need heterotrophs in general are anything that needs to eat other organisms to get that nourishment. Now there are different types of heterotrophs. And this is something that you guys are maybe familiar with when we talk about these vocabulary words. So the different types of heterotrophs are carnivores. Carnivores are meat eaters. They only eat animals. Okay, so that's what a lot of predators are considered, right? We think of carnivores as lions. We think of carnivores as cougars, anything that really hunts their live animals. Then we have something called omnivores. Omnivores means that you can eat both animals and plants. So we have lots of different, I'm an omnivore, for example, and there's a lot of organisms that eat both plants and animals, just depends on what the availability. Tell me some more names, Christian. Go ahead and put some names for cougars in there. And then we also have something called herbivores. And herbivores are animals that only eat plants, right? And it's not just limited to animals, right? Organisms in general. But we have these, so these are the three types of heterotrophs. So carnivores eating only other animals, red meat typically, or not red meat, just other animals in general. Omnivores eat animals and plants, and herbivores eats only plants. Let me give you guys a second here because I think this is a good slide to be writing down if you haven't already. So good, Christian. So a fun fact for the day, cougars can also go by mountain lions, puma, and the cougar, which that makes so much more sense to me because I always got confused. I think it just depends on the region, right? So I'm going to give you guys about a second to write all of this down, letting me know when you are ready to move on. All right. Okay. So now there are different types of, we can continue on. There are also something called scavengers. So scavengers are organisms that only eat dead animals. They do not kill their food. So we often think of this as vultures, right? Vultures, if you see, it's kind of like that iconic scene in a movie. If you see vultures kind of circling around, it usually means that there's a dead animal or something that's dead, because they're the ones that, they're not the only ones, but they're an example of an organism that only eats dead animals. They don't kill their food, they just look for it, right? So they're considered scavengers. Then we have a heterotroph called decomposers. And decomposers break down dead or decaying plants and animals. We often think of decomposers if you are, if anybody at home does some sort of composting, then you would be very familiar with decomposers, right? Decomposers are things like fungi. Decomposers are things like so fungi under that umbrella are mushrooms. Decomposers are considered worms, right? They are the ones that break down dead and decaying plants and animals to then get their foods. And then the leftover is actually very rich nutrients, which is why in composting is so highly recommended, because if you use like live matter, so like leftovers like the peels of bananas, of fruit, leftover apples, those all they're all still considered living matter. And when these decomposers eat, then they release those nutrients into the soil, which then plants and plants take up. So it's a really great way to use nature's reoccurring cycle. And you're going to learn about these different cycles. Yeah, Eva. So if you have a compost, do you know what's in what you use as decomposers in your compost? Do you know? Some people put in worms. Some people have different types. Yeah, so you put in peels. Yes, exactly. Yep, that's exactly right. So you can use different types of food sources for the decomposer. Good. Yep, exactly. And it returns nutrients to the soil. All right, so we talked about the food chain. So we talked about a very specific lineage of how we obtain our energy. But as we know, especially with ecosystems, the food web is so interconnected. So we're not just talking about one chain. In fact, the food web are multiple food chains. Yeah. So as a matter of fact, when we look at this diagram, and if you can't see it very well, don't forget that you have your you have your zoom in and zoom out in the bottom right corner. So if you can't see it all that well, make sure that you are clicking that plus button to go a little closer. But if you take a look, the food web is going in all directions. Remember that the arrows go in the direction of the energy. So the phytoplankton, I mean, if we take a look at this, right? If we take a look at this bush, the bush is not eating the mallard duck, right? The mallard duck is eating the bush, and then that is the energy is getting absorbed into the duck. So that's one really important thing when we're looking at arrows. That's why I stress it so much. So we see that there are multiple food chains within this food web. I mean, look at the crane. The crane can eat multiple different types of organisms. It's not just one food. There's not just one chain, but you can have like the same chains or multiple chains within the food web, but everything is interconnected. Everything depends on one another. If a predator is not there, the population doesn't have anything in check and it can be overrun. And then if there's too many mallard ducks, that means that they're going to be eating all of the food. And this is going to create an issue for all of the plants and the bushes that it eats, right? So a food web is really, really dynamic. And it shows all of the interactions among organisms in an ecosystem. Now, food web is really going to focus on the living organisms. We talked about how ecosystems include the organisms and the soil, the abiotic factors. But in this case, When we talk about the food web, we're really focusing on the direction that energy travels and how it goes through the ecosystem. And there are numerous food chains, like I said. So there are different types of pyramids. We use pyramids as a way to organize information, to make it visual. And this is one way that we use a diagram to explain how things are related. So there are two main types of pyramids. There's the pyramid of energy. So this is kind of like where we're going to see mostly our food chain. So both of these are representing the food chain. However, this one is focusing on the levels of energy. Now, we know there's something called the law of conservation of energy, right? Where we know that energy cannot be created nor destroyed, but only transferred. But when we eat and when we're consuming food, we're actually only consuming 10% of energy from that food source. The higher up you are, the less energy you're getting from that food source. And the most of it gets lost to heat. Because remember that when we work, when our body is working, we're always taking a little bit of that energy and it's losing it to heat. So when we take a look at this pyramid of energy, we see that the primary producer, it has all of the energy, right? The primary producer is creating their own energy. They're not losing it to anything. But the first level consumer only gets 10% of that energy. The 90% of the energy is lost by heat. Same thing with the second level, the third level, right? So we have to think about that when we're talking about where is it better to be, on the top of the pyramid or on the bottom? Where does that energy really go? How much more food do you need to eat in order to compensate for that loss of energy? Then we have the pyramids of biomass and numbers. Biomass is just what it sounds, the actual amount, the mass of life in that level. So we have a lot more biomass on the bottom. We have a lot more plants. And then as we go up, we have less and less, right? So really seeing that there's these two different types of pyramids when we talk about ecology. That is the end of this slideshow that I have for you. So these are the big ideas of ecology. Now you will go through more, and when you go through your lessons, there will be more details. There's going to talk about more about biomes, so you'll learn a little bit about biomes. You're going to talk about the importance of biodiversity, so the different types of organisms that live together, of life that live together. And you're going to learn a little bit more about how everything is interconnected and the importance of your abiotic factors. But that's what I have for you this Tuesday morning. And so, let me know if there was anything that you missed that you would like me to go back into the slides for. Otherwise, that's our lesson for today. Does anyone have any questions? You are so welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. Welcome back from spring break. Don't forget we have small group. Don't forget that we do not have a test this week, and we do not have